On March 22nd, 2017, the Boomer Guidemaker player Caxer the 1337 made a post on the r/Battlecat subreddit titled The Ranged Meatshield Theory, Another Class of Meatshields into the Meta. In this post, Caxer talks about the classification of meatshields and how the newly recognized ranged meatshield would fit into the role. Meatshields are typically units with low cost, cooldown, and range, with the main purpose of defending your other units by taking hits for them. The short range allows meatshields to walk into the range of other enemies, forcing them to attack instead of moving forwards. A ranged meatshield, as described by Caxer, doesn't actually enter the enemy's range at first, but rather stands outside of it. While this does seem like a flaw given the regular job of a meatshield, a ranged meatshield's purpose is to actually act as a second layer of defense, which reinforces your frontline even more. In theory, Caxer said that combining ranged and regular meatshields could optimize meatshield stalling potential by covering each other's weaknesses. Examples of ranged meatshields he cited were Rampage Cats, a 375 cost 330 range seasonal unit, and Fungi, a 90 cost 200 ranged meatshield from the Neo Mushroom Garden collab event. Rampage Cats was seen as pretty impractical, as 375 cost was too much to be a good option on most stages, but he had niche uses in stages like the Haunted 1LDK and Beverly Hills Scoop. In the Haunted 1LDK, his high range let the player lure Miss Haka in front of Lord Gravy without triggering her burrow, allowing your attackers to hit Haka and juggle her more easily. In Beverly Hills Scoop, using Rampage and other ranged meatshields caused Taki to be lured closer than usual, mitigating the damage he would do to your attackers. Instead of using your meatshields to splash your attackers, Taki would shoot past your stack of attackers since they now stood where the meatshields were. He could also be used on Labyrinth of Hades, meatshielding from Bun Bun while making Corey land waves less. Because Rampage Cats outranged Corey, there was no risk of a meatshield walking into Corey's range, allowing Bun Bun to more easily make Corey miss. Although using Rampage Cats here wasn't a cure-all for these stages, this proved that he could satisfy the ranged meatshield theory. Fungi Cat's cost of 90 made him a more practical ranged meatshield, but with a low range of 200, he would act like a regular meatshield for most enemies, as if your range is less than the enemy's, you stop becoming a ranged meatshield for them and just become a regular meatshield. But still, Fungi Cat worked on some short-ranged enemies like Zhang Ru or Gory Black, making him a decent option if the player wanted to use a ranged meatshield on these enemies. The biggest problem with Fungi was actually just that he was a limited collab unit, where Neo Mushroom Garden would end up being an extremely rare collab that hardly reruns, making obtaining this unit in the first place quite difficult. Caxer also talks about pseudo-ranged meatshields, units like Legs and Sanzo Cat, which are units that also act like ranged meatshields but aren't brought to be solely used as one. Caxer said that because of this, using lower cooldown units usually tended to be better than longer cooldown ones. Although not fully developed, the initial ideas from the ranged meatshield theory served as grounds for more and more derivative ideas to come about from it. On October 12, 2019, Lucas IV released a video titled The Ranged Meatshield Theory, where he talks about the theory and reviews the ideas talked about in Caxer's original post. He mentions additional units such as Noodles and Cameraman, as well as even more applications of the topic. Importantly, more attention here was brought to the idea of pseudo-meatshields than Caxer's original post. As said by Lucas, you might have been applying the ranged meatshield theory without realizing it. While the original ranged meatshields of Rampage Cats and Fungi may be impractical, a lot of other pseudo-ranged meatshields were relevant in the meta and sometimes seen in very relevant stages. Cyborg and other ranged attackers served as ranged meatshields in Ogre Island to reduce Berserk Corey waves, and Cameraman worked extremely well as one when commonly used against low-range enemies. Even units like Dragons were ranged meatshields when brought to a stage like Vulcanizer. The fact that most players already used attackers and support units like these, which acted as pseudo-ranged meatshields, solidified the idea that ranged meatshields could end up being practical, something that would silently become more relevant as the game progressed. Despite the ranged meatshield theory starting to become more practical, discourse around it would actually end after this video for the most part. A unit like Cameraman Cat, with its cheap 540 cost, chance to survive lethal damage, and 250 range made it the perfect ranged meat shield considering its cost-efficient damage output to make up for the higher cost. Even so, Cameraman technically remained a pseudo-ranged meat shield despite fitting all the requirements for a simple reason. Cameraman was only an efficient ranged meat shield because she was already a good cost-efficient unit first, and a ranged meat shield second. In these examples, being an already good unit was basically mandatory for these units to work well as a ranged meat shield, kind of turning the theory from an intended strategy into a bonus that would work in the background to help you win with your already strong meta units. Because of this, the original interpretation of the Ranged Meatshield Theory with specific units for the job basically became obsolete to most players, even turning into a meme buzzword for some. Despite this, the core principles of the Ranged Meatshield Theory still remained intact. Meat shields with more range than enemies acted as a second layer of defense, had their unique benefits for certain strategies, and pseudo-meat shields that were already good units remained powerful users of this technique. So my question to you is, what happens when we change the definition of what we call a meat shield in the first place? What if every unit is a meat shield? It sounds really dumb, but this line of thinking is what brings us to the next theory, a sort of evolution of the Ranged Meatshield Theory. From niche ranged meat shield units to the rise of pseudo-meat shields, we have now reached what I like to call defense density. The defense density theory has a few components to it. Firstly, it states that every unit in the game has some defensive value. Or, in other words, every unit in the game is a meat shield. As long as the unit can tank a hit for something, then inherently it can add to your defenses. For example, even though you might be using something like Pizza to kill short-ranged enemies, because he can tank hits for your other attackers, he temporarily becomes a meat shield upon being hit by enemies. Pizza will stall enemies very briefly, similarly to a meat shield, and can do this every time he gets attacked by an enemy until he dies. Secondly, attackers can protect other attackers. When Pizza gets attacked directly and becomes a meat shield, all your other attackers, such as potential seafarers, slapsticks, can-cans, couriers, and whatever else you have run, are being defended due to the enemy frontline being stalled. The next unit to get hit after Pizza does, let's say it's a seafarer this time, is now meat shielding for all the rest of the units, including Pizza. This ends up creating a cycle where your attackers meat shield themselves, and although not as effective defensively as running traditional meat shields, this does provide a good amount of protection for a lot of your units. Finally, the third part of this theory states that units with lower cooldown and cost, as well as health and damage, work better as defensive units than others. Health is self-explanatory, while cooldown goes back to what Caxer said about pseudo-ranged meat shields in his original post, where the more units you can produce means more ranged meat shields. A lower cost allows you to sustainably produce more of the unit, which plays into the same reasons as cooldown. Damage might seem like a weird stat, but you can think of it like this. The more damage a unit does to enemies, the more it will lead them to getting knocked back. Knocking back enemies pushes them backwards and temporarily stops them from attacking, which would help protect your other units. When you look at this last rule, it makes a lot of sense why pseudo meat shields become as useful as they were. Having better stats in general allowed them to tank more hits from units and act as ranged meat shields better. It also solved a core problem with the Ranged Meatshield Theory, which was cache inefficiency. Units like Rampage Cats were always cache inefficient, serving as a ranged meat shield and not doing anything besides that. Strong statted units that happen to work well with defense density will actually end up doing damage to enemies, and as a result help you complete a stage faster. Killing enemies also allows them to get cash back, and a better ability to cycle between enemy drops for cash allows you to avoid running out of money. Anyways, combining all three principles, we get the full defense density theory, which basically just means that the more units you spawn, the better they are at protecting each other and creating a stronger, more dense defense. Note that this is different from the Ranged Meatshield Theory, as this applies to all units regardless of range, even working with Can on R-Ost for example. There's a handful of applications for this, the first one being the idea that you don't need to add more regular meat shields for a stronger defense. Of course, while you still need some, you can avoid having to run 4 or 3 meat shields by just running more cost-efficient spammable attackers. Can, or many of the strong mid-rangers in the game. A lot of the time nowadays, people just run 2 meat shields as in dual erasers, and if you were to test just those 2 erasers in many endgame stages, you'd actually see that enemies still push very hard and melt through them like butter. However, the moment you add attackers, enemies push much slower down the field because they have to get through both your meat shields and attackers now. Even if your attackers did 0 damage, their innate defensive value in being there would slow down enemy pushing power. This is what allows one of the most underrated meat shield lineups in the game to be effective on pretty much all of it, which is just Manic Eraser and Rock. Just 2 units with no combos, and this meat shield lineup, while very poor defensively without attackers, becomes surprisingly strong when you add cost-efficient fast cooldown attackers in. Even just adding Can, you can see a hugely noticeable difference in how this lineup is at defending against enemies. The defense density theory tends to synergize extremely well with Rock in general, as Rock can temporarily protect all units on the field, allowing your units to create denser stacks, and during its downtime your existing dense units can protect each other if they happen to get hit by enemies. Of course, not every stage needs the same type of defense lineup. There's some where dual erasers and Rock combined are the best, some where you want Research Rock or Research and a specialist meat shield like Ramen, and some where more defense is redundant, so you might just want a single meat shield like Manic Eraser or Zhangxi. It all depends on what stage you're playing. One of the biggest counters of using the original Ranged Meatshield Theory in a strategy was enemies with piercing abilities, being able to hit all of the ranged meat shield stack at the same time, which essentially nullified the extra defense. As the game progressed, more and more enemies got LD, Omni Strike, Waves, Surges, and Blast, so this became harder to utilize. When using defense density like this, and having your high stat attackers be defenses instead, this turns out to work much better. Instead of draining your money on ranged meat shields that will die to pierce, you'll be spending your money on what you want to be spending it on anyways, which is attackers. And a reduced usage of traditional meat shields will prevent wasting cash when multiple of them die from the same piercing attack. This isn't a definitive answer to pierce intensive stages though, as the best answers to Wave and Surge nowadays are just spamming Wave Block and Surge Immune. But if worse comes to worse, reducing the meat shield count for more attackers could end up helping. Rock also tends to be very good in these situations, improving the idea with synergy even more. Rock is kinda just really good, you know? Defense density also doesn't require you to run a low meat shield lineup like Eraser Rock for it to work. Let's say you're running a 4 meat shield lineup with attackers, and you start to run low on money. If you've ever been in this situation, and decided to reduce the amount of meat shields you were spawning in favor of spawning attackers, you've been using the defense density theory. Even though the number of meat shields has gone down, because you now have attackers that do something on the field, you are overall in a much safer position, and might even be able to get your cash back by killing enemies. Using more meat shields at times might not even improve your defense if the stage is good at countering mass meat shields. Sometimes offense really is just the best defense. One thing that is pretty cool to think about is how the practicality of heavily utilizing defense density like this has only risen due to stat inflation that happened over time. The original Ranged Meatshield Theory was from 2017. This is before even the release of UL or talents. Not every gacha rare or super rare had its true form yet as well. With units getting more stats from powerful true forms, new abilities from talents, and the plus 20% stat boost if you so happen to buy it, alongside the level cap going from 40 to 50, base stats have gone up quite a bit. Back then, most units had very little health and tended to die in just 1 or 2 shots. Think about how strong Paris was back then. But nowadays, a lot of units actually have pretty good survivability, usually tanking a few hits from enemies, or a lot if your name is Can. Interactions in Battle Cats change drastically if a unit lives an extra hit, and this can lead to strategies working multitudes better. The rise of research has also been a big proponent in this. Although it works without research, defense density is particularly noticeable when you reduce the cooldown of your attackers even more, and often because of the high cash drain, you'll end up reducing meat shield count naturally. Utilizing defense density like this simply wasn't a possibility back then because there weren't enough tanky and efficient units. so this is a type of strategy that has only become possible due to the power creep Ponos has added. As the game progresses, I predict that the meta strategies for stages will end up having less and less meat shields, and slowly but surely move away from the idea of 3 meat shield lineups, or even dual erasers entirely. After all, we're constantly receiving stronger and stronger attackers, whether lower cooldown mid-rangers or more expensive and stronger units, although last time we got a significant buff to traditional meat shields was probably just when Rock came out in 10.2, over 4 years ago. Specialist meat shields have continued to get better with time as well, making research lineups remain a staple for the future. Of course, this doesn't exactly mean that defense will hang behind as we move forwards. Units like Courier, Royal Guard, and more fulfill defense density incredibly well, and we will most likely continue to get more of them as time goes on. Our defense isn't inherently worse, it's just different from the older playstyle the game has seen for years. If we think about it further, the meat shield isn't even technically an official role that Ponos themselves have directly made for the game. It's a term the community decided to give to low-cost units who protect others by dying. Despite years of traditionally using meat shields to protect us from everything, if we just take a closer look, we can understand the defensive value of every unit we bring to this team, not just meat shields, and make the best suited defense for all stages in the game depending on what's inside them. Some of the hardest stages in the game get cleared with very little traditional meat shields, some of them without any at all even. I think when you add in Ubers as well, you'll have less slots for traditional meat shields and instead have to reduce them in favor of adding essential support attackers, like Can or Slime. A lot of good endgame players I know just run Manic Eraser solo or with Rock, as having overwhelming offense with Ubers tends to work better in the endgame meta. Let's take a brief moment to think about what the ideal abuser of defense density would be if they existed. They would most likely be a good ranged meat shield, with low enough cost and cooldown, on top of having decent generalist stats to provide good value. For example, imagine we had Kasa Jizo's first form, but gave them more health, the ability to survive a lethal strike, and just because we hit 30,000 subscribers recently, let's give Jizo 30 more Pierce in the form of Omni Strike. On top of that, how about we let him use stat talents and other talents from this true form so that he can scale better with endgame. If this unit were to exist, it would be an incredible utilizer of defense density. Let's call this unit that may or may not exist in the future Dark Jizo. After using Dark Jizo on stages, it all of a sudden feels like the Ranged Meatshield Theory is back in full force. The increased stats allow him to survive hits from stronger enemies, while the low cost cooldown and survivability allow him to stack up very efficiently. In fact, after testing Dark Jizo around on a good amount of stages, I think he would end up being one of the strongest units in the game if he so happened to exist. Wait a second. So, now that Jizo's Ultra form has come out, it seems the player consensus around him is that he's really broken. And yeah, a one-button spam fest to counter the majority of stages in the entire game seems pretty broken. His only weakness is that some enemies with higher range than him and fast attacks can be pretty good at stopping him, but even then Jizo is still going to shred pretty much anything in that stage, unless you're on a really specific stage like Soractes. I do think the most interesting outcome from this upgrade is that Jizo not only outshines every single mid-range DPS unit in the game, but also competes with the generalist meat shield for defense. Jizo stacking up with decent bulk, guaranteed survive, and a fast cooldown provides enough defensive value that you can pretty much get away with just running one meat shield alongside Jizo, whether that be Manic Eraser, Zhangxi, Rock, or a specialist meat shield. Research combos as well take Jizo into an even further extreme, as with minimum cooldown from research, you don't even need meat shields anymore on a lot of stages because Jizo is the meat shield now. Really, Ultra Kasa Jizo is kinda just broken in removing the need for most other mid-rangers, and even replacing traditional meat shields with defense density. I guess Jizo didn't need more range, that much pierce, or a fancy offensive ability, but rather just some very good defensive improvements that allowed him to fulfill a role that we were lacking good units in for a long time. Honestly, Jizo is basically just the final boss of Paris Cat, and as we could have guessed from earlier, probably the single best example of defense density in the entire game. On a side note though, The original script for this video was made like 4 months ago, and since then we've gotten some pretty nice units to talk about in this video. Jizo's Ultra Form came out, which was mentioned earlier, but also Lunos was released, which again is a pretty big addition to defense in the Uber meta. Lunos is quite an interesting unit given his properties as a 10-second conjure spam unit with knockback and mini surge, allowing you to push back or stall a lot of different enemies. Combined with defense density, you can use Lunos or even other conjure units to help keep your stacks of units alive, which again is a synergy not really possible with traditional meat shields. Although I will say that if you actually have Lunos, you probably don't need to worry about this in general, since he's an incredibly broken unit that is basically the Uber equivalent to Cyberstack. But hey, the more you know. Honestly, given the fact that we got 2 extremely powerful Ubers lately that aren't really traditional backliners, with Ultra Casa Jizo and Lunos, it makes me wonder if Ponos is going to keep adding more Ubers that feel more similar to non-Uber units, like spammable mid-rangers. Although it isn't the highest priority on my wish list, I do think that having more variety in types of Ubers would be more interesting, as well as having them play into the more niche mechanics of the game, such as defense density. But that's just a theory. A defense density theory. Thanks for watching. And thanks again for 30,000 subscribers. I'll see you guys again in the next video. Bye!